looked down at my legs. They had gone black.
And I turned to go into the subdivision, and I black out.
It was like she was having a nervous breakdown.
Linda was collapsed, unconscious on the floor, next to the butcher knife.
I kind of thought, whatever it is.
I just did not want to lose my legs.
Next, two medical mysteries that defied the experts. When Diane Dyke's legs turn a bizarre and horrifying color, she's confronted with a shocking twist of fate. She may lose her legs or have to accept something even worse.
I was afraid I was doomed to suffer like this for the rest of my life. I was desperate to be put out of my pain.
Then, Linda Smith doesn't think too much about her agonizing migraines. In fact, she thinks she's got them under control. Until she begins experiencing terrifying blackouts and puts her family's lives in danger.
I thought, my God, I could have gotten us killed. I can't ignore this.
Linda was born to a humble farm family in southern Minnesota. She was a strong little girl who learned the value of hard work at an early age. But when Linda hits puberty, her body begins to change in ways that she never expected.
I started just being very fatigued, lightheaded, dizzy, weak, very weak. By the end of the morning chores, I would be very sick.
Despite her strange symptoms, Linda keeps them to herself.
When you're one of 10 kids, you don't go to the doctor for every little sniffle. You just don't. If you had a headache, or if you were nauseous, or if you were coming down with the flu, you were still expected to get your chores done.
Linda does her best to manage her symptoms through the rest of her adolescence. And when she turns 18, she decides to leave the Minnesota cold and farm life for the bustle of Los Angeles. But almost as soon as she touches down in California, a new and very unexpected symptom begins to emerge.
I started to notice migraines. It was very dramatic. It was almost like when I got off the plane, I could feel something's different. They were immense. They were off the charts immense. It made it very difficult for me to focus.
Linda's chronic migraines, along with her dizziness and fatigue, make it next to impossible to concentrate on her new job. Desperate for some relief, she makes an appointment with a neurologist. He immediately orders a CAT scan to see if there's anything unusual about her brain. But the results come back normal.
And he said, you know, everything looks fine. You know, you are in Los Angeles. We are smog capital of the world. Maybe you have a sensitivity to the smog.
Linda resolves to manage her symptoms on her own and begins to experiment with various over-the-counter medications, but none of them seem to help.
The headaches were still very intense, just exhaustion. I felt exhausted. I really felt like I needed to get a better handle on my health situation. I thought, it's time for a change.
Linda decides she's had enough of the smoldering LA heat and smog and moves back home to Minnesota. When she walks out of the airport and the frigid air hits her, something odd happens.
Immediately, the headaches were gone. I mean, it was dramatic. It was like, oh my gosh, where are the headaches?
Linda is completely taken aback by the sudden improvement in her health. And as soon as she's feeling up to par, she decides to try living on her own one more time. After just 3 months in Minnesota, she packs her bags again and heads to sunny Florida.
As soon as I get into Florida and I get out of my car, it's like, wow, they're back. The headaches came back. They were at least 10 times more severe than any of the headaches that I even had in Los Angeles.
Despite the return of her dreaded migraines, Linda sucks it up and tries her best to manage them with pain relievers. She perseveres, and soon after landing a job, she meets Dan Smith.
I was working for a delivery company, and Linda was one of the secretaries at a business that I delivered to. And a short time after that, we began dating.
Linda is happier than she's ever been, and a year later, they announce their engagement.
I really was excited about meeting her because she was marrying my brother, who I love very much, and I immediately fell in love with Linda.
It isn't long before Dan notices Linda's headaches, but she assures him that they're nothing to worry about.
Linda was never interested in seeing a doctor. Going to a physician was not high up on her list.
But then, Dan picks up on something that suggests Linda could be worse off than either of them realize.
One day we were out for a long walk, and we came back to our apartment. And as we walked up the flight of stairs, I noticed that Linda's pulse was quite fast. And I stopped and asked her if I could take her pulse rate. It was running so fast I had a hard time counting it. When I asked her about it, I was kind of surprised at her response.
I asked Dan, well, this has happened to you, right? This happens to you, right? He says, no, it doesn't.
She was in great shape, and she really was, and she worked out every day. It didn't make sense that her heart rate was running so fast by walking up a flight of stairs.
Until one day in late October, when Diane notices a strange sensation in her right foot.
When I sat down and took my shoe off, I noticed that there was 2 red bumps on the arch of my foot. And I thought, well, how did a spider get in my shoe and bite my foot? That was the only thing I could think of.
Diane dismisses the odd mark and goes to bed. But nothing could have prepared her for what happens the moment she wakes up.
I went to get out of bed and I fell to the floor. My foot was swollen 2 times its size. The 2 red spots seemed to have spread. It looked like someone had beat me with a baseball bat. The pain was excruciating, and so I crawled to get help from my husband. Scott was quite horrified when he saw my foot, and so he picked me up and he took me right down to the emergency room. When they finally got me there, the doctor looked at it and he thought I had a hematoma.
A hematoma is a mass of blood that is collected in an organ, a body space, or in tissue as a result of a broken blood vessel.
He thought I must have hit my foot and didn't know it. I thought that was very strange because how could I hit my foot that hard and not know it? So it didn't make any sense to me. I just followed his directions, which was to take anti-inflammatories, to use crutches, and to not go to work. And if it didn't get better, to go to my primary care physician.
Sure enough, the bruising and pain slowly begin to fade. But a few days later, just when Diane thinks she's out of the woods, a strange new symptom rears its head.
I was having lots of red spots, and they seemed to be connecting like a road map on my legs. It was bizarre.
Frightened, Diane makes an emergency appointment with her family doctor. He too is puzzled by the odd pattern of spots and assures her they'll get to the bottom of it. But after performing a series of specialized tests, the medical team comes up empty.
They really didn't have a whole lot of information for me. It looked like everything was normal.
Frustrated and more than a little worried, Diane heads home empty-handed. But it isn't long before the painful episodes return with a vengeance.
The attacks would come on usually in my feet and would progress from my toes to the ankles. I was getting bruising and red streaks. There would be swelling and bumps all around like there was tennis balls underneath my skin. It was excruciating and it was really frightening.
Over the next several months, Diane visits doctor after doctor in a desperate search for answers. But no one can explain the baffling attacks.
It was so disappointing because it was just this vicious cycle of go and get poked and prodded and then wait and get no results.
Then, 6 months after Diane first noticed the strange mark on her foot, things take a sudden turn for the worse.
work one day, I could feel the swelling and the discomfort was extending into my ankles. I took the students outside to play on the playground, and then we came back into the building, and I played with the children until finally I could not ignore it at all anymore. I had to get to the bathroom, and I barely made it there. I looked down at my legs. They had gone black. This bloody, black, discolored, inflaming, whatever it was. I don't believe I've ever felt pain like that in my entire life. I felt like there was a million bugs crawling underneath my skin, and there was burning. It was so scary. I did not know what to make of it. I went to the front desk to have the secretary buzz Scott in his classroom. When he saw what was going on, he was extremely frightened. He picked me up and put me in the car to take me directly to the emergency room.
After taking one look at Diane's black and swollen legs, the ER nurses put her on a stretcher and rush her into the nearest exam room.
There was a frenzy of activity around. They put me on pain medication. It wasn't really helping anything. A nurse came in every few minutes to check me, to take blood, and the doctor at the hospital had no clue what was going on. He said he would have some specialists come visit and take a look and see if he could get some help with my case.
Just a few minutes later, a vascular surgeon arrives to examine Diane's legs.
At that time, it was as black can be. He said he had never seen anything like it. He was touching my thigh area right above where the discoloration stopped, and he said we'd probably have to take it off right here.
She took my blood pressure and my heart rates, and she said, you know, something's definitely not right here. But I would like to run an EKG and see how this test turns out.
And just coincidentally, I had spoken with my mother and explained what was happening to Linda, and she asked whether or not there was any chance that Linda might be pregnant. She explained that she had had some scenarios herself where her heart rate changed when she was pregnant.
So Dan went and got an EPT test, and sure enough, I'm pregnant. So I called the doctor back and explained to her it's a positive test, and we decided that EKG was no longer necessary.
The Smiths eagerly await the birth of their first child. But at 6 months, Linda begins to experience some unusual cramping and makes an appointment with her obstetrician. Then, after a brief examination, the doctor delivers some devastating news.
We sat down and he said, you know, I just want you to know that you're very young, you're healthy, and you and your husband can try again. I was devastated. And I remember calling my husband and telling him, we're losing the baby. You know, I asked, what went wrong? You know, I took my prenatal vitamins, I drank plenty of fluids. What happened? And he said, what we think may have happened in your case is that the baby just didn't get enough oxygen or blood volume. And it wasn't enough to take care of it. I couldn't comprehend that.
Linda and Dan start out on the slow road to recovery. And just 3 months later, they begin trying to conceive another child, despite the fact that Linda's migraines, dizziness, and lightheadedness are the worst they've ever been.
I was very afraid that maybe I could never have kids. This is a dream of mine. I wanted to be a housewife and a mother and to have a large family. I knew something was wrong, but I kept thinking about what the doctors in Los Angeles had told me. Don't worry about it. Try not to think about it. It'll get better.
Linda does her best to push through her painful symptoms. And when she and Dan find out they're pregnant in March of 1987, they're overjoyed.
She was ecstatic, and so was I.
I'm like, this is great. Hopefully everything will work out with this pregnancy.
And in November of 1987, she gives birth to her beautiful daughter, Christina. But within the first 48 hours after Christina's birth, Linda's symptoms take a dramatic turn for the worse.
She felt dizzy again, started to have some situations where she felt like she couldn't hold the baby.
She couldn't walk, she was falling over, very dizzy, woozy. She just was totally wasted.
But Linda believes she just needs some time to recover after giving birth. She decides to take it easy until she regains her strength. And then, one day a few weeks later, she ventures outside for the first time since Christina was born.
This one afternoon, I decided I'm going to take Christina and we're going shopping. I hadn't done that in a while. It's a very warm day out, and I'm thinking, gosh, I could fall asleep. I'm just exhausted. And I turned to go into the subdivision, and when I do, I black out.
Because my legs had turned black, he thought that there was gangrene coming on. He thought that there was no oxygen getting to my tissue.
Gangrene is a type of tissue death which occurs as the result of an insufficient supply of blood. Without treatment, it can quickly spread to vital organs and lead to death.
It was extremely upsetting to hear him say that word, amputation. I was scared out of my mind because I couldn't imagine life without my legs. He went to my heel and he felt a pulse, so he said to the nurse, I'm not going to take them off yet, but we're going to have to keep a close eye on it, and if we lose that pulse in her heel, then call me back immediately. And he left the room. I was so glad when that doctor was heading out the door. After he left, I thought to myself, I don't ever want to see that doctor again, because I just did not want to lose my legs.
Over the next several days, doctors find themselves racing against the clock, performing countless blood tests in an all-out effort to determine why Diane's legs have turned pitch black.
They test me for leukemia. They tested me for some types of lymphoma cancer. They test me for rheumatoid arthritis. And day after day, I got no answer. They had no idea why I had had this attack, what it meant, what it was connected to, nothing. I rested in bed under the covers and I prayed for an answer.
But the tests reveal nothing. And after 5 days, the swelling and discoloration simply fade away on their own, leaving the doctors completely baffled.
They decided to discharge me because they didn't know what was wrong or what had brought it on. It was horrible. I mean, how many times can my legs keep coming back? I didn't know.
Frightened and frustrated, Diane returns home, but the mysterious attacks only intensify.
What started to be 1 day a week became 2 days a week, then 3 days a week of flaring. Like I'd work through Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and by Thursday, Friday, I was having a flare-up. And by Saturday night, I was completely unable to walk. I was embarrassed to really talk about it or show anyone what was happening, but it was becoming increasingly more difficult to hide the symptoms.
I remember her being on crutches at school. Her legs looked like just the surface blood vessels have just burst, and it would turn real red, bruised and black and blue, and it slowed her down.
I wasn't able to give my students everything that they needed. I was distracted by my own pain, and no matter how hard I tried to overcome it, I wasn't able to walk well or play with them. I was missing more and more work. Going outside or standing seemed to bring on a flare-up. It seemed the only safe thing to do was stay in bed. I was afraid I was doomed to suffer like this for the rest of my life, in cycles of extreme pain. I saw my life slipping away, and I was losing all hope.
As the months turn into years, Diane's pain and distress take an ever-increasing toll on her marriage.
Diane started pulling away from Scott because she didn't want to be a burden on him.
The marriage was suffering terribly. I felt unlovable. There was a day that finally came that I felt so broken that I thought Scott would be better off without me. And I remember seeing the look on his face when I told him that I wanted to leave. I really felt like I was dying inside, and he didn't want me to go. But I went. I thought I was doing him a favor. I made choices for him that weren't mine to make. And I ruined everything that mattered to me most.
It was like she was having a nervous breakdown. Diane hit rock bottom.
I would pray that someone would just shoot me and put me out of my misery, because I couldn't imagine living this life anymore.
Linda immediately makes appointments with a team of cardiologists and neurologists who promise her that they will get to the bottom of her terrifying episodes. But while they search for a diagnosis, the blackouts, or what the medical experts call syncope, continue.
It was happening quite frequently, and if I stood, sometimes I would only stand for 15 to 20 seconds, and I'd be in a gray out, and very quickly afterwards, I'd pass out.
Over the next several weeks, Linda is in and out of the hospital as she undergoes a battery of medical tests. While they can't seem to identify what's causing her heart rate to randomly race out of control, they suggest a drastic measure to help regulate it.
And he said, you know, I don't know what this is, but we really may need to consider doing a pacemaker implant.
Although the pacemaker could control her heart rate and help suppress the blackouts, Linda is horrified by the thought of having one.
80-year-olds have pacemakers, not 25-year-olds. I felt old.
Linda is on the fence about having the pacemaker surgically implanted. But one evening, while making dinner, the choice becomes crystal clear.
And I go out to the kitchen, and I had taken some meat out of the refrigerator, and I got a carving knife out to cut the meat up. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get sick. And I turned around, and just as I turned around, I passed out cold.
I walked into the kitchen and saw my daughter in her high chair, and Linda was collapsed and unconscious on the floor. Next to Linda was the butcher knife.
This was the confirmation to me to go ahead and have the pacemaker implant.
2 days later, Linda is rolled into the OR for the surgery. And almost immediately afterwards, her life begins to change.
I get up and I use the restroom, and I look in the mirror. I have a glow in my face. I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I look like with pink in my face.
After the pacemaker was put in for a long time, Linda saw a really marked difference in what was happening to her. Her episodes of passing out really went away.
Over the next few years, Linda and Dan have 2 more children. And despite her very busy life juggling her family's schedules, Linda is able to manage her migraines, dizziness, and fatigue one day at a time.
I'm able to get a pretty good handle on some of the other symptoms. I start to drink more fluid, and I start to take frequent rest periods throughout the day.
But on a very hot summer afternoon in 1993, Linda's world is once again turned upside down.
One day I decided I'm gonna mow the yard. And I'm about halfway through when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I get this immense pain that shoots across my chest, goes down my left arm, up my neck, and into my left side of my face. And I get into the house, and I called Dan at work, and I said, Dan, I'm really not well. You need to come home. And I pass out while speaking to him on the phone.
Dan rushes Linda to the ER. And his sister, Mary Ellen, a registered nurse, meets them there. Their fear at the time is that the pacemaker has simply stopped working.
I went out and I spoke with the nurses at the desk. I said, I'm really worried about my sister-in-law. She's having chest pain and her blood pressure's really low. Can somebody help her? They just kind of rolled their eyes, essentially, and didn't really respond.
My doctor was really frustrated with my case. He didn't know what else to do, so he decided that he was going to send me to the University of South Florida to see if they could help figure out what this mystery disease was.
In February of 1993, Diane makes an appointment with dermatologist Dr. Philip Schenefeld at the University of South Florida in Tampa.
We talked with her about her problem and examined her skin. Clinically on the skin, she had little sort of purplish marks, what's called palpable purpura, that were slightly raised. There were also some reddish areas. As she sat there in our office, she was gradually getting a few more of the purple spots moving up her leg. I don't recall having seen anything with the purpura where they were just appearing right in front of us.
It's a critical clue for Dr. Schenefeld, and in that moment, the mysterious case of Diane Dyke suddenly comes into focus.
Our office tends to be kept fairly cool. The spreading made us wonder whether there was some factor, such as cold, that was making her have these spread. At that point, I had felt that we needed to test for a specific protein that might be related to cold exposure that might be involved in this process.
He seemed rather confident, but I had also heard that from the doctor before that, so I knew better than to get my hopes up too high.
To confirm his hunch, Dr. Schenefeld has Diane's blood drawn and sent to the lab for testing.
It was exhausting to wait to hear something that could be great news or it could be bad news, but I just wanted to hear some news so we could get to the bottom of it.
The wait seems endless, but finally, 6 days later, the results are in.
My hunch was confirmed. Diane did have cryoglobulinemia.
Cryoglobulinemia is a blood disorder in which the body produces excessive amounts of defective antibodies called cryoglobulins. In healthy individuals, antibodies help fight bacteria and viruses. But in patients like Diane, dangerous amounts of the faulty antibodies are produced. When her temperature drops significantly below 98.6 degrees, these cryoglobulins can cluster together in blood vessels, blocking circulation and inflaming the vessel walls.
Cryoglobulinemia means cold, globe-like structure in the blood. In Diane's blood, what's happening is that the blood, as it chills, it turns into a sort of a semi-solid. Just like if you mix up a batch of Jell-O and pour it into a mold and you let it sit and then you cool it, her blood turns into the jelly-like material.
The moment that he told me that I had cryoglobulinemia, I remember feeling as if I was in a vacuum. I could see his mouth moving, but I really wasn't making out what the words were that he was saying. That just really didn't make any sense to me.
Dr. Schenefeld goes on to explain that all of Diane's seemingly unrelated symptoms were triggered by the air conditioning in her home and school.
When the cooling occurs and the blood gels in the little vessels in the skin, blood behind it can't get through. The cryoglobulins were also signaling an inflammatory process to start up in the blood vessel. Then that weakens the vessel wall, and so the vessel can actually break and have blood leak out.
I started to look back and realize that I would go outside with my students and get sweaty and warm and come back into the cold, and I was having flare-up after flare-up.
With each episode, her blood vessels would rupture, causing the severe discoloration and swelling.
As the blood vessels burst, initially the color is more reddish, and once it's out in the tissues for a while, It can change more to a blackish color. There can be swelling because the blood has difficulty getting back up the legs because the channels have been damaged.
Unbeknownst to Diane, every time she crawled into bed, she was helping to diminish the effects of the condition.
Staying at home under the covers would allow the legs to warm, would allow the jelly material to turn back to normal liquid.
But as soon as she was back on her feet, her legs would be exposed to cool air again, and the agonizing attacks would return with a vengeance.
It was all kind of starting to come together, but it was hard to grasp everything he was explaining to me.
And after struggling with the debilitating disease for more than 2 years, Diane can't help but wonder why it took so long to get a diagnosis.
Cryoglobulinemia is relatively rare. We don't know why people like Diane develop this process. Cryoglobulins will not show up specifically in other blood tests. It takes doing the specific procedures to look for them, to find them.
But the harsh truth is undeniable. If Diane had not been properly diagnosed when she was, her future would have been bleak.
It's possible to have kidney failure or problems with circulation in the heart that might lead to heart attack or stroke. Progressive damage to the blood vessels can lead to either difficulty with walking or actual need for amputation.
Within a month, Linda and Dan board a plane headed for Nashville. Dr. David Robertson is now in charge of Linda's case.
Well, I came by her room soon after she arrived, having heard that litany of problems that she had faced.
He sits down with us and he explains what tests they're going to run. And I think, let's do it.
Dr. Robertson's goal is to try to figure out why Linda's heart rate and blood pressure are so variable.
The body regulates blood pressure and heart rate so that they are at the appropriate level while you're lying down, while you're seated, and while you're standing. And that level must be high enough that all the blood can get right up to the brain.
First, Dr. Robertson gives Linda a specialized exam called a tilt table test, in the hope that it'll shed light on her abnormal heart rate.
The head of that tilt table gradually goes up as we are monitoring blood pressure and heart rate to give us the full picture of what the heart is experiencing at that time.
The test confirms that Linda's blood pressure and heart rate hit shockingly high levels when her head is elevated.
Normally, the heart rate might need to go up 10 beats per minute to keep blood going to the brain where it needs to be. In Linda's case, there was an immediate increase in her heart rate of 32 beats. And moreover, the blood pressure had to rise also.
Next, Dr. Robertson begins conducting a test to monitor Linda's catecholamine levels. Catecholamines are a type of neurotransmitter released from the nervous system to regulate heart rate and blood pressure.
What we then did was to assess the catecholamines. During our tests on the tilt table, we found that they were extremely elevated, and this confirmed the nature of her problem. It really had to be orthostatic intolerance.
Orthostatic intolerance, or OI, is a condition caused by a defective autonomic nervous system, the system that controls involuntary body functions like digestion, blood flow, and body temperature. Patients with OI can't make necessary adjustments to counteract gravity when standing up, and blood from their heart, lungs, and brain pool into their lower extremities, causing a drop in blood pressure. Suddenly, all of Linda's symptoms make sense.
If the blood flow to the brain is impaired, a great many symptoms can emerge, like fatigue, rapid heart rate, migraine, headaches. Some people with orthostatic intolerance, well, they have the feeling like you're going to pass out. That's quite common. But there were times when Linda completely lost consciousness. That is very dangerous if you are in situations where you can harm yourself.
And finally, Linda and Dan can understand why they lost their first child.
It's possible that there can be loss of a fetus if blood flow to the fetus is not maintained. We can't be sure in this case if that was a factor in the problem that Linda experienced, but it could have been.
I remember when he left the room, sorry, thanking God, thank you. Thank you, Father in heaven. Thank you. I was so relieved. It was over. It was over. I had a diagnosis that I thought I can start to regain my life. I don't have to put my kids at risk anymore. I can work with this. I can do it.
While Linda feels a definite sense of relief after suffering for more than 2 decades, she can't help but wonder, why did it take most of her life to get diagnosed?
The difficulty in evaluating someone with these kinds of symptoms is that each symptom could have many different explanations.
The good news is that while there is no cure for orthostatic intolerance, it can be managed.
There are drugs which reduce the excessive stimulation of the heart.
There's one more crucial thing Linda can do to maintain her health. Since excessive heat can raise a person's heart rate, this can be especially dangerous for people with OI. The heat in Florida is only exacerbating Linda's problem.
So we made the decision that we would move back to Minnesota, where Linda's from originally. A climate that was better suited for Linda would be better suited for all of us.
I thought it'll be such a blessing when that's over and I don't have to face that day after day.
Unfortunately, though, Diane must now learn to live with a grim reality.
There is no cure that we know of for cryoglobulinemia. The first treatment is to keep the extremities warm. Another factor that can be used to treat the inflammation is a steroid anti-inflammatory.
I had expected there would be a clean-cut answer to overcome it and to beat it, but that was not what I got. So it was a very overwhelming moment.
Individuals with cryoglobulinemia have to avoid exposure to cold as a key factor in their daily living. We don't think what it would mean to have that kind of limitation in our lives.
The normal everyday activities that I'd so often taken for granted would not be safe for me to do anymore. So I had to wear gloves and mittens and lots of layers of clothing. And that's just not something that's normal in a grocery store in Florida, to see someone with full-on ski gear just to get through their shopping experience.
Diane must also make sure to limit the amount of stress put on her body, which unfortunately means giving up her most cherished hopes.
It is inadvisable for someone with cryoglobulinemia to have children. Blood clots are a higher incident during pregnancy. That broke my heart. I'd always wanted to have children. I even had their names picked out.
Today, Linda's kids are almost all grown up, and she and Dan have dedicated their lives to helping others cope with this little-known condition through their National Dysautonomia Research Foundation.
I thought if you could start an organization that would help to give patients the ability to reach out to other patients would be very helpful.
There are a large number of people that are impacted and can't find adequate care.
And there were times I wanted to give up and not persevere. I knew if I did that, I was going to put my children in harm's way, myself in harm's way, and quite possibly complete strangers in harm's way. And I couldn't do that.